Let's talk about the exercise that should be considered for the highest priority in anyone's training protocol. The full range of motion back squat is potentially one of the highest reward training exercises that someone can perform regularly. If you are not dealing with any injuries, then the squat should be one of the most emphasized tools for physical development. The squat is a complex full body and multi-joint focused exercise that requires a certain level of coordination and flexibility while simultaneously improving the muscle activation needed for this coordination and eventually mobility. Every squat might look a bit different depending on individual anatomy and body types, but this tutorial will offer some of the objective considerations we can all start with to build and perfect our squat. Certain body types can be more of an advantage in the squat. Think of the person with short limbs and smaller ranges of motion as opposed to an athlete like me with longer legs. But that doesn't mean that this should be an excuse for somebody not to squat or just settle for having a poor quality squat technique. Remember, humans are made to squat. For most of our ancient ancestors and in many less modernized places today, the deep squat position is a standard resting and working position. Deep down in our genetics, our body wants to squat. Now, some of us might have lost the ability to comfortably squat or feel access to this big range of motion, but that just means that our body needs to adapt and correct the poor posture that sitting in chairs and cars has brought into our society. Frequent squatting with full range of motion and high quality is not just a leg muscle focus, but it is also beneficial for bone density, joint mobility and stability and posterior chain strength. Focusing on this functional movement can lower the risk for injury and pain in the back, knees and hips. Remember, more range of motion, accessed and strengthened will make the body more resilient and able to function at a high level later into life. An additional performance benefit to squatting is that it generates a lot of power output, which can help maximize athletic potential. The squat targets a lot of muscle fibers at the same time. We do not only train our quads, hamstrings and glutes with the squat, but also your erector spinae, and the core is functioning to stabilize the body's midline. Women are oftentimes afraid of getting a thick waist from doing heavier squats, but studies using EMG measurements have shown that the lower back and the erector spinae is much more activated than the core muscles often thought of when wanting a narrow and lean waist. So before we get into the specifics for a perfect squat, let me remind you that this is an exercise that is just as much to improve mobility and functional movement as it is to gain strength and muscle quality. First, we want to look at the stance. Your squat stance should be about hip width, or for some people as wide as the shoulders. There is no definite rule since everybody's hip anatomy is different, but working from hip to shoulder width is a great rule of thumb. I recommend that you try some different positions and see what feels most comfortable for you, while allowing you to squat as deep as possible with quality form. Pointing the toes forward or with a slight 5 to 15 degree turnout is ideal for most body types and hip structures. People with ankle mobility issues or deep hip sockets will be more likely to point their feet out more. So find what works and don't be afraid to adjust to maximum comfort and activation. If we point our feet out more than needed, then it can become more difficult to activate the glute medius and track the knees out safely over the big toe. This can be also explained by creating a tripod foot and externally rotating the femur during the setup. This is crucial in order to stabilize the knee in the movement and also to create more space for the hips in order to keep the upper body upright while squatting down. If you notice significant mobility limitations in your ankle joint, I recommend that you start to squat with full range of motion by elevating your heels. This will allow your knees and hips to work into full flexion by acting as a progression towards desired ankle mobility. Of course, you should be working on your ankles additionally with a combination of soft tissue rolling and specific ankle stretches. People with very poor ankle mobility should perform ankle mobility exercises 3 to 5 times per week, and definitely a minimum would be prior to squat sessions. But keep in mind, squatting frequently will be a major contributor to increase your strength, comfort and accessibility to full range of motion. Use the heel elevation as long as needed to be able to squat with quality posture and depth while building strength specifically in your knees, hips and stabilizing muscles. Then don't be afraid to try some squat sets without the elevation to test your improvements. Everyone is different, so be patient and keep squatting. If you notice mobility issues in your hips, I recommend you to perform these stretches. Now let's talk about the ideal placement for the bar and your grip. The bar should sit comfortably on top of your traps to rest over your center of mass. Since this is a high bar squat, the barbell may feel a little bit uncomfortable at first, but this positioning will allow for the most upright and full range of motion version of the squat. The grip can actually be considered like a solid push-up grip. Position the hands about 2 to 4 centimeters outside of the shoulder to allow for a strong support and active upper back. Your elbows are pointing slightly up and back, which helps to create quality tension in your upper back muscles. Make sure that your bar is not positioned too high in the rack. You shouldn't need to go on your toes in order to lift the bar out, but you also don't want to perform a half squat to unrack either. The rack should be at about chest height. While unracking the bar, you should have an even stance. After you lift the bar from the rack, you should ideally take 2 steps and end up in your squatting stance. Basically, set yourself up to make as little movement as possible and conserve your energy for the actual squats. Okay, now we are getting into the actual movement of the barbell. While squatting down, our goal is to keep a vertical bar path over the middle of our foot. In order to create this vertical line, we want to make sure that our body stays as upright as possible while being balanced and using proper squat mechanics. Of course, we will always have a slight lean with the torso, but in a high bar squat, this should be minimized. We never want to lean so much that the pressure goes to the front of the foot or counterbalances excessively into the heels. The key here is to stay balanced and upright. In order to keep your vertical or upright posture, you can pay attention to your focal point, which should be horizontal, and not too low, which can cause you to lean forward or lose position. If your spine starts to round, then your balance will follow. The simple cue to avoid this is chest up and eyes forward. In order to squat low and maintain the barbell load over our center of mass, the hips and knees will need to simultaneously go into flexion. As I mentioned earlier, we want to go into full flexion with both joints and use all the available range of motion that the ankle can offer. A design function of the ankles, knees and hips is to be able to go into full flexion, and loading these in the squat will make the surrounding tendons and ligaments stronger and resilient. So we have to let the knees track forward and shins angle past vertical to reach that nice and deep squat. I'm saying this intentionally because there is still a common belief that it is bad for your knees to travel forward and over the feet when squatting. If you choose to squat like this, then you will find it difficult to squat low and definitely have an excessive load on your lower back. As long as your hips, knees and ankles are not injured, then loading them into full flexion is not only safe but also encourages maximum functionality. Never forget, in a squat our heel should never lift from the floor, as this causes excessive pressure on the knee and imbalanced loading. If your heels want to lift off the ground in the bottom of your squat, I recommend that you continue to focus on improving your ankle mobility and start using weightlifting shoes or elevated heels. Make sure the pressure on your foot is evenly distributed on the heel, side of the foot and your toe, aka the tripod foot. In your shoe, your feet should look like this. Create a nice arch by grabbing the floor with your feet. This can be performed even better when you are pushing your knees out while grabbing the floor with all your toes. Just pretend your foot is a hand that is twisting open a bottle top. Effectively pushing the knees out will immediately help you with your squat strength and range of motion. You will be able to get deeper into the squat, and most likely you will be able to lift heavier weights because of efficient glute medius activation. Banded steps are a great drill to perform as a warm-up in your squat program to strengthen this position. So how low should the squat be? My answer, as low as possible. You should use the full range of motion that your body allows, and only take away depth if you are recovering from injury or experiencing pain. With full depth squats, often comes the question about the butt wink. The butt wink is describing the position when the lower back is going into excessive flexion in the bottom position of the squat. The butt wink is not a hamstring mobility issue, as people oftentimes think, but usually a combination of imbalance, lack of coordination and tight ankles. Ankle mobility issues are usually blamed the most, but it is more often caused by an insufficient position and activation of the right muscles. Oftentimes only a shift of the body weight from having too much pressure on the heels to shift more towards the middle of the foot where we want to be and pushing the knees out will enable the athlete to correct the flexion of the lower back. I also recommend that you try a little wider stance, which can create more space in the hip. But I also want to say that a little bit of flexion is acceptable, especially if the athlete has no discomfort here. When squatting up, you should think of squeezing with your hands, pushing your upper back into the bar and keeping your chest up, all while actively driving the knees out. Your knees and hips should extend at the same time and to the same degree. What I occasionally see is people first extending the knees and then the hips. As you can see, the bar path is not vertical anymore and far out over our feet, which means that our spine needs to carry way too much of the load. You don't feel your glutes in a squat? People tend to think that they should feel their glutes in the squat more than I would expect. Since the squat is such a complex exercise, a localized burn in the glutes will most likely not happen. But there is no doubt that the glutes are activated to its full potential when the squat is performed correctly and at progressively heavier weights. For most of us, the quads are more active and stronger than the hamstrings or glutes, which is why they are usually recognized to burn first. If somebody wants to feel a burn in the glutes, it is always a good idea to perform extra isolated glute exercises within a higher rep range. But remember, they will not replace your squat as a training stimulus. Squats are allowing your glutes to work more load and being more fully activated than in isolated exercises. So if someone's goal is to get the most of their glutes in terms of hypertrophy, a back squat should never be missing in the training program. Ideally, breathing is natural when squatting. Before you descend, you can take a nice deep breath into the belly to support the spine. And when you come up from the squat, you can exhale to finish the rep. When weights are getting heavier, a more intentional breath and core tension might be necessary, but I would recommend getting comfortable at lighter and moderate weights before feeling the need to brace for maximum tension and maximum weights. I recommend that you perform squats 2 to 3 times per week based on your goal. Of course, you can always mix squat variations to keep it varied and interesting. For more absolute strength focus, you might want to stay in a rep range of 1 to 5 reps, and for more hypertrophy and leg endurance, 6 to 12 reps are great. In order to get a big squat, you should mix rep ranges within your training program to hit all stimuli, and don't forget about including tempo and pause squats. The tempo squats are great to help strengthen and adapt your squat's full range of motion, since the emphasis is about accumulating time and attention in proper position. The added time and attention also increases intensity without needing to increase the load on the barbell. It is a win-win situation for low risk and high reward on the body.